So next big thing, that's something that is obviously appealing for everyone here in the room. We heard about big data and analytics. Another huge topic is virtual reality, augmented reality, immersive computing, immersive reality. Lou Kerner is one of the experts in the topic, here to give us a talk about virtual reality and Israel. Lou Kerner.
Okay. Thanks, Eve. Actually, the topic that I'm going to talk about is innovation. And real quick, by way of background, I was an equity analyst. I then started some companies. I became an angel investor and then a VC, and now I'm on my second fund, which is focused 100% on investing in tech companies founded by Israelis. And I first got interested in innovation when my first company was started out of Idealab, which is one of the original internet incubators. And it was an incredible place to work. And since that time, that was in 2000, I think I visited more incubators and accelerators than anybody I've met. I actually put on a conference in San Francisco called Incubate, about incubators and accelerators. And among the other areas that I help some academic institutions, including UCLA and the Technion, on their innovation and tech ecosystems. And I originally got the idea for this talk on innovation a few months ago when I was reading a book on the Wright brothers. And when I was reading the book, I thought that I knew the story of the Wright brothers. They were the first people who flew in 1903 at Kitty Hawk and became world famous. And in fact, that wasn't the story at all. It's a great book. And the story was they, in fact, are from Dayton, Ohio, went 500 miles to Kitty Hawk, where the flying conditions were ideal. And they flew the first humans to ever fly, powered flight, and nobody cared. And they flew a few more times at Kitty Hawk, and nobody cared. And then they went back home to Dayton, and they built another plane. And over the next 2 years, they flew 50 more times in Dayton, more than 25 of those flights, setting the world record for the longest human flights ever. And nobody cared. People in Dayton would go, oh, look at the Wright brothers and their crazy plane up there. And it wasn't until 1908 when the Wright brothers were brought to Paris, and they flew in Paris for the first time. And that day, they became the most famous people on the planet. And the New York Times actually sent a reporter to Dayton to get the backstory of the Wright brothers. And he spoke to the editor of the Dayton Daily News. And he asked him, how is it that for 2 years you had the Wright brothers flying overhead and you never once reported on it? And he replied, I guess the truth is we were just plain dumb. And what I was shocked, and what that kind of brought out is, you know what? It's even when it's right overhead, it's really hard to see innovation. And in another related story, I mentioned I worked at Idealab, and it was called Idealab because Bill Gross, the founder, this incredible genius, couldn't stop coming up with ideas. And eventually, to organize himself, he actually created the book of ideas. And he limited himself to having 100 ideas in the book. And after a little while of doing this, he decided to crowdsource from the 65 employees at Idealab on how good they thought his ideas was. And he did that by giving them phantom dollars. And they could take the phantom dollars and invest them in the new idea that just went into his book. And if that idea ever became a company and the company became successful, those phantom dollars could actually become millions of dollars. And he did this over 50 times. And the single lowest investment participation by the employees of Idealab was in what I consider to be the single best idea in the history of mankind, paid search. Google ended up copying that idea. They ended up executing on it a little bit better. But Bill did okay. He sold his company, Overture, to Yahoo for $1.6 billion. But the two of those stories combined, I think, brought me to the realization that, in fact, as humans, we really haven't evolved to recognize breakthrough innovation, even when it's staring us in the face. And it turns out you can't crowdsource innovation either. For the second lesson that I've learned, I want to use the Amazon share price, I think is a great illustration of this. And that's Amazon went public in May of 1997, and over the next 2 years, its share price went up over 90-fold. And then it's been talked about, as David talked about, the bubble burst, and over the next 2 years, it went down over 95%. And now, 15 years later, it's gone up more than 100-fold since that bottom. But why is it that we get euphoric, and then we get depressed, and then we get euphoric again? And I think the reason for that is because, again, as humans, we actually think in a linear fashion. And innovation doesn't really happen in a linear fashion. It doesn't, it's more of an S-curve, as we've talked about. And in fact, it turns out, as I looked into this, that there's actually a law similar to Moore's law that describes this phenomenon. It's called Amare's law. And Amare's law is that we tend to overestimate the impact of major technological breakthroughs in the short term and underestimate the impact in the long run. And I always try to remember that as an investor. And for the third point and final one that I'm going to make today is related to my life experience with Facebook. One of the companies that I ran was called Bolt. We were the biggest social network in the world in 2004, and we were actually quite acquisitive. I did 8 acquisitions in 3 years. And I was actually the first person to call Mark Zuckerberg and offer to buy Facebook a couple months after he launched. And he offered to sell me a quarter of the company for $20 million, and I laughed in his face. And fast forward about 5 years, I watched the inexorable rise of Facebook. And in late 2009, somebody offered to sell me some shares of Facebook. And as I mentioned before, I'd been an equity analyst, so I thought, I could model it out. They were offering to sell it to me at $16 billion. And I put on my analyst hat, and I ran some numbers. And I actually believed at that time that it was worth $50 billion. I was shocked. I'd never seen that kind of mispricing of assets at that scale. And so I bought the shares, and I just felt compelled to write my first research report in 10 years. And I opened up a Tumblr blog, and I put the report up, and it actually went viral. So, former Goldman Sachs analyst said Facebook's worth $50 billion. And about 99.9% of the comments were highly derisive of me and Goldman Sachs. But what's interesting about this story is if you look, when I look back, when I was writing this research report, it's actually the first time that I actually looked back at the report. And it turned out that my projections from 2010, and I didn't even have any information from the company, this is just taking publicly available information, but my revenue projections from March of 2010 were off 1% for 2014 and off 6% for 2015. And obviously there's a lot of luck that goes into it, but how is it that I was even able to get in the ballpark of what the revenues were? And that's, the simple belief that I have is that engagement equals dollars. And if you can engage people, that is incredibly hard. And not that monetizing it is easy, but relative to engaging people, monetizing is very easy. And the corollary to that is that you're either growing engagement, and therefore users and revenue, or like Twitter, you're dying. And lastly, the question I get asked most, now that I'm 100% focused on Israel, is why Israel? And isn't Israel already kind of done? And I wrote a blog post kind of when I decided to start spending 100% of my time on Israel in June of last year, called Why I'm Doubling Down on Israel. And the analogy that I used in that blog post about my enthusiasm for Israel actually used my experience with Facebook as an analogy, in that when I pounded the table on Facebook, Facebook was already a $16 billion company. So it wasn't like I was the first person who said Facebook is an amazing people. Other people had invested in it 5 years earlier. But my point was, even at $16 billion, the world has no idea the impact that Facebook is going to have. And that's how I feel about Israel. I think ecosystems, a lot of the work that I've done in innovation and looking at ecosystems can be virtuous circles. Startup ecosystems, when they're happening right, whether they're in a city or a university or a country like Israel. And what's going on in Israel, I think I'm not the first person to say the Israel ecosystem is amazing. The book Startup Nation was written 6 years ago. But my point is even as amazing as the world thinks Israel is, I think the world has no idea the innovation and the wealth creation that's going to happen in Israel over the next 10 years. Thank you very much.